Ethan Cade's boots echoed softly on the cold, metallic floor of the lunar outpost. It was a far cry from the war zones he'd been in as a soldier, but in many ways, this felt worse. The suffocating quiet, the calculated atmosphere of the military installation, and the distant hum of machinery were all too calm for the storm of thoughts raging inside his head. "Commander Cade, report to the diplomatic wing," the voice over his earpiece ordered. Breaking the silence of his thoughts, Ethan exhaled slowly, squaring his shoulders as he approached the entrance to the meeting room. Inside, diplomats and scientists were gathered, discussing the urgent matter that had brought him here. They all wore the same look, grim, uncertain. Something unprecedented was happening. The Kyle had arrived on Earth a week ago, their sleek obsidian ship hovering like a ghost over the moon's surface. The ship had descended without warning, and their leader, Lirana, had requested an immediate audience with Earth's officials. Their reasons, however, had remained secret until just today. What Ethan had heard from his superior officers had shaken him to the core. "We need to create a hybrid child with human DNA," they had said. A biological crisis had crippled the Kil, a once powerful species that now teetered on the brink of extinction. They couldn't reproduce, and Earth, humanity, was their last hope. Ethan entered the room, nodding to the attending officers. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension, but the real source of the discomfort stood near the far wall, waiting in silence. Lirana, her appearance was as mesmerizing as it was alien. She stood tall, her silver skin catching the sterile light of the room, her golden eyes reflecting back a quiet intensity. She was stunning, not in a way that felt familiar to Ethan, but in a way that left an imprint on his mind, one he couldn't shake. Long, sleek black hair framed her face, cascading over her shoulders like the midnight sky. But it was her presence, her otherworldly aura, that dominated the space around her. Her gaze followed Ethan as he approached, her antennae twitching slightly as she studied him. "Commander Cade," she said, her voice a perfect blend of softness and power. "I am glad you've come." Ethan tried to ignore the sudden rush of adrenaline that flooded his veins. Why does she affect me like this? He wondered, shaking the thoughts from his mind. He was a soldier after all. He was trained to deal with threats, not whatever this was. "Lirana," he greeted her formally, nodding his head. "I've been briefed on your situation." The shadow passed over her face, but she quickly regained her composure. She took a step closer, her eyes locked onto his. "It is more than dire, Commander. My people are dying." There was no emotion in her voice, no pleading or desperation. But the weight of her words struck him deeply. You said our DNA is compatible," Ethan asked, still struggling to grasp the enormity of what she was proposing. The briefing had been short but shocking. Human DNA, it seemed, was their last hope to prevent the extinction of their species. Lirana nodded. "Extensive research was conducted before we came here. Our genetics are more similar to humans than any other species we've encountered. But we need your help. We need you." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, feeling the pressure of her request settle on him like an immense burden. "When you say you need us, I mean exactly what you fear, Commander." She interrupted him, her voice cool but firm. "I need you to father a child with me." For a moment, Ethan's world narrowed to just the two of them. The sterile environment around them faded, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. Her words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. "You will breed me now, human," she said, her golden eyes piercing into his. "For the sake of my people, I am your alien toy for life." The rawness of her statement, the absolute certainty with which she spoke, rattled Ethan. He had prepared himself for battle, for death on the battlefield. But this was something else entirely. Lirana," Ethan stammered, trying to regain his composure. I understand the gravity of what I'm asking, but there is no more time. Each day that passes is another step toward extinction for my people." Her voice softened and her antennae twitched with what Ethan could only guess was distress. "This isn't about personal desire or conquest, it's about survival. I need you, Commander, not just as a soldier but as a partner in this." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. His training had prepared him for combat, not for making decisions that could change the fate of an entire species. He felt a strange connection forming with her, an invisible thread pulling them closer despite the vast chasm between their worlds. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice low. "Out of all the people you could have chosen, why did you come to me?" Lyra's eyes softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw something vulnerable beneath her strong, collected exterior. "It wasn't just random chance. Our research revealed more than genetic compatibility. You possess certain traits, certain qualities that make you an ideal candidate. And there is something else," she admitted quietly, glancing down before meeting his eyes again. "Your presence has affected me. My body responds to you." The air between them felt charged, and Ethan suddenly understood what was happening. The Kyle pheromones, something about their biology, was creating an undeniable attraction between them. He felt it too, a growing pull that defied logic. "You're saying I don't have a choice?" he asked, his voice a mix of confusion and reluctance. Lyra stepped even closer, her gaze never leaving his. "You do have a choice. I cannot force this upon you, Commander. But I am asking you, begging you, as a Kial woman, as someone whose entire race is on the line. Will you help me?" Ethan stared into her golden eyes, feeling the weight of her plea in the silence that followed. His sense of duty clashed with the ethical questions raging in his mind. Could he really do this? Could he father a child with an alien, even if it meant saving an entire species? The implications were overwhelming. "Lyra, I don't know how to process all of this," Ethan confessed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "I'm a soldier, not this." "I know," she replied softly. "And that's why I chose you. You understand the importance of sacrifice. You fought for your people. Now I ask you to fight for mine." Her words struck him like a blow. Ethan knew what it meant to make sacrifices. But this was on a scale he had never imagined. And yet, as he stood there staring at her, he couldn't deny the connection building between them. It was primal, beyond anything he had ever experienced. His mind reeled, but his instincts told him that this decision would have far-reaching consequences for both their worlds. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan sighed heavily and nodded. "All right, Lyra, I'll help you." The tension in the room lifted slightly, and Lyra's shoulders relaxed. There was no relief in her expression, though, only a solemn acknowledgement of what came next. "Thank you, Commander. You don't know what this means to me. To my people." Ethan wasn't sure he could fully grasp the enormity of his decision yet. But he knew one thing. His life and the future of both humanity and the Kyle had just changed forever. The lunar base buzzed with the frantic energy of uncertainty as diplomats, scientists, and military personnel moved about in hurried conversations. News of the Kyle's desperate situation had spread quickly among the leadership, and the atmosphere grew thicker with tension by the minute. Commander Ethan Cade found himself at the center of it all, an unlikely participant in what had become a full-blown interspecies crisis. Despite the bustle around him, his thoughts were consumed by the conversation he'd just had with Lyra's Noah. He stood near the observation deck, looking out at the black expanse of space where the Kyle ship hovered like a phantom above the moon's surface. Its sleek, obsidian hull reflected the distant starlight, a stark contrast to the pale lunar landscape below. That ship represented the last hope for an entire species, an alien race teetering on the brink of extinction. And now, somehow, he was caught up in their salvation. Ethan's hand tightened into a fist at his side as he tried to steady his racing mind. He was a soldier, not a diplomat, not a geneticist. How had it come to this? How had he become the one responsible for such a monumental decision? A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Commander Cade," came the sharp tone of Major Dawson, the base's second in command. The older officer's face was a mask of authority, but there was an undeniable strain behind his eyes. "The Council has requested your presence in the briefing room. They're ready to discuss the Kyle proposal." Ethan nodded, pulling himself away from the observation deck. "I'll be right there," he said, though his legs felt heavier than usual. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but there was no avoiding it. He had agreed to help, and now there was no turning back. As they walked together toward the briefing room, Dawson cast a glance at Ethan. "You look like hell, Commander. You sure you're up for this?" Ethan forced a grim smile. "I'm fine, sir. Just processing everything." Dawson grunted. "I don't envy you, Cade. This whole thing is a nightmare. I've never seen anything like it in all my years. And that Kyle woman, Lyra Nee, she's a force, I'll give her that. But what she's asking, it's insane. Ethan didn't respond. He knew it was insane. The very idea of creating a hybrid child to save an alien species was beyond comprehension for most. But it wasn't just Lorana who had asked. It was her entire species, and they were on the brink of annihilation. The door to the briefing room slid open with a hiss, and Ethan stepped inside. The room was filled with Earth's top diplomats, scientists, and military leaders. At the far end of the table, Lirana stood, her silver skin shimmering under the harsh lights, her golden eyes scanning the room with the cool, detached focus of someone who had no time for indecision. Ethan could feel her gaze land on him as he entered, but she gave no outward reaction. General Wallace, the head of the lunar base's military operations, sat at the center of the table. His broad shoulders and graying hair gave him an air of authority, but there was a grim expression on his weathered face. To his right, Dr. Elena Vasquez, Earth's leading xenobiologist, was furiously typing notes into her datapad, her eyes darting between the gathered officials and Lyra. General Wallace cleared his throat and leaned forward. Commander Cade, thank you for joining us. I understand you've had some significant discussions with our Kyle guest. Ethan nodded, taking a seat. Yes, sir. I've spoken with Lyrana. She explained the situation in detail. Wallace's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm sure she did. This is an unprecedented situation, Commander. We've been reviewing the Kiala proposal, and frankly, it's causing quite a bit of debate among the Council. The idea of using human DNA to father a child with an alien species, it's raising a lot of ethical questions. Ethan glanced across the table, where Dr. Vasquez spoke up. We've reviewed the genetic data Lirana provided, she said, her voice calm but tense. The compatibility between Kale and human DNA is remarkable. In theory, it should be possible to create a hybrid offspring that could correct the Kale's reproductive issues. However, the long-term effects are unknown. We're venturing into uncharted territory here. Ethan frowned. So you're saying it's possible, but we don't know what will happen? Exactly, Vasquez replied, her fingers pausing briefly on her datapad. There are no guarantees. The hybrid child could inherit traits from both species in ways we can't predict. There's also the issue of the child's development, whether they would even be able to thrive in either environment. And that's before we even get into the ethical implications. And the room fell into a heavy silence. Ethan could feel the weight of their gazes on him. They were waiting for him to speak, to make sense of the impossible decision laid before them. But what could he say? He had agreed to help. But even now, he wasn't sure he fully understood what that meant. Lirana broke the silence, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I understand your concerns, she said, her tone measured but firm. But you must also understand that my people do not have the luxury of time. Every moment we spend debating is another moment closer to our extinction. We have tried everything: genetic manipulation, cloning, artificial insemination. None of it has worked. Your people are our last hope. General Wallace leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. We're not unsympathetic to your situation, Lyrana, but you're asking us to make a decision that could have far-reaching consequences for both our species. We can't rush into this. Lyrana's gaze hardened. My people don't have time to wait for your deliberations, General. Our reproductive crisis is worsening by the day. Our males are sterile. Our population is dwindling. If we don't act now, there won't be a Kyle species left to save. Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the stakes at hand. Ethan could see the strain on her face, the weight of her species' survival pressing down on her. She was their last hope, just as much as they were hers. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. What about the psychological implications? She asked. This hybrid child you're proposing, have you considered the effect it might have on them? Being caught between two worlds, two species? Lirana hesitated, her antennae twitching slightly. We have considered it. We understand that this child would be unique, unlike any other being in the galaxy, but they would be a symbol of hope, of unity between our species. A bridge that could ensure the survival of both our worlds. Ethan shifted in his seat, finally finding his voice. But there's more at stake than just the child's future, isn't there? he asked, his eyes locking onto Lorana's. What happens if we go through with this and it doesn't work? Or worse, what if it works too well and we start seeing demands for more hybrid children? Lyra met his gaze, her expression unreadable. You fear what this could mean for your people. I understand that. But what I'm asking for is not conquest or domination. We are not here to invade or take over your world. We are asking for survival, nothing more. General Wallace cut in, his voice gruff. It's not just about survival, Lorana. This could change everything. Politically, socially. There are factions on Earth who will see this as a threat, not a request for help. And we've already seen signs of that. Ethan's stomach tightened at the mention of the human supremacist group, Earth's Flame. He'd heard whispers about them for years. Radicals who believed in the purity of humanity, who rejected any form of cooperation with alien species. The moment they got wind of this plan, they'd see it as an abomination. Lyra eyes darkened. I'm aware of the dangers, General, but I would remind you that the survival of an entire species is worth any risk. A sudden beep interrupted the conversation. One of the security officers at the back of the room glanced at his tablet, his face paling slightly. General Wallace, we've got a situation. Earth Flame just released a statement condemning the Kyle proposal. They're calling it the ultimate betrayal of humanity, and they're threatening to take action. The room tensed immediately. Ethan's heart sank. He had known Earth's Flame would react, but the speed at which they mobilized was frightening. If they acted on their threats, this diplomatic situation could turn into an all-out war. We need to increase security around the base, Wallace ordered, standing up. Double the patrols and make sure no unauthorized personnel get anywhere near the Kyle delegation. Lorena's expression remained calm, but Ethan could see the flicker of concern in her eyes. These extremists, do they truly pose a threat? She asked quietly. Ethan nodded grimly. They do. Earth Flame isn't just a group of fanatics. They've got resources, weapons, and they're not afraid to use them. If they see you or your people as a threat, they'll try to stop this by any means necessary. Lorana's face hardened with resolve. Then we must act swiftly. We cannot let them sabotage what little chance we have left. Ethan looked around the room, sensing the growing unease among the others. The situation had escalated far beyond diplomatic negotiations. Now, it was a race against time. Not just to save the Kyle, but to prevent a potential disaster on both sides. Commander Cade, General Wallace said, turning to him. You've already agreed to help Lorana. I'm putting you in charge of her security detail. We can't let Earth's Flame get anywhere near her. Understood. Ethan stood and nodded. Understood, sir. As he moved to leave the room, Lorana caught his eye, her voice soft but firm. Thank you, Ethan. I know this isn't easy, but together we will see this through. Ethan gave her a tight-lipped smile, his thoughts racing as he prepared for what came next. This wasn't just about science or politics anymore. The unfolding crisis had become personal, and he would do whatever it took to protect Lorana and the future of both their species. The lunar base was now a maze of chaos. Red lights flashed across the corridors, signaling a breach in the outer defenses. The distant echoes of gunfire and explosions reverberated through the walls, each sound a reminder that Earth's Flame had launched their assault. They were no longer just a threat. They were here. Ethan Cade and Lorana sprinted through the winding halls, moving swiftly toward the hidden medical bay deep within the base. Ethan's pulse raced, but his military training kept him sharp, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. Behind him, Lorana kept pace, her face a mixture of determination and barely concealed fear. Her antennae twitched with every shift in the air, sensitive to the tension surrounding them. We're almost there, Ethan called back to her as they rounded another corner. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, knowing that if they didn't reach safety soon, everything would be lost. Their plan, the future of the Kyle, everything. The doors to the medical bay finally came into view, a reinforced entrance that had been designed to withstand nearly any assault. Ethan rushed to the keypad, punching in the security code with trembling fingers. The door slid open with a hiss, and he quickly ushered Lorraine inside before sealing it behind them. Inside, the sterile room was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Advanced medical equipment lined the walls, and at the center of the room stood Dr. Amelia Kess, Her brow furrowed in concentration as she prepared for the task ahead. "Commander Cade," Dr. Kess said, looking up briefly from her instruments. "We're ready, but time is short." Ethan nodded, his breath still heavy from the sprint. "Earth's flame is here. They're moving fast. We don't have long before they reach this sector." Lirane stepped forward, her gaze focused entirely on Dr. Kess. "We need to begin the process immediately. There's no more time for hesitation." Dr. Kess hesitated for a brief moment, glancing at Ethan. "Are you sure about this? The risks?" "I know the risks," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. "But we don't have a choice. If we don't act now, it's over." Dr. Kess gave a small nod, then gestured toward the examination table. "All right, let's get started." Lirana moved with purpose, lying down on the table as the medical equipment whirred to life around her. The cold, clinical beeps of the machines filled the air, a stark reminder of the gravity of what they were about to do. Ethan stood beside her, his heart pounding not from fear but from the enormity of the decision they had made together. As Dr. Kess worked, prepping Lirana for the hybridization procedure, the tension in the room grew palpable. Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of the future, of what would happen if this plan succeeded. If the child they were about to conceive could truly save the Kyle, it would change everything. But the dangers were real. Earth's flame wasn't just here to stop them. They were willing to kill to prevent the hybrid from being born. "We need to move quickly," Lirana said softly, her golden eyes meeting Ethan's. "Every moment we delay gives them more time to find us." Ethan nodded, but his gaze remained locked on her. "I promised I'd keep you safe, and I will. We'll see this through." There was a long pause between them, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they'd formed in the brief time they'd known each other. It wasn't just the pheromones anymore. It was something deeper, a shared determination to fight for survival. Hers, her people's, and now his as well. Suddenly, a deep rumble shook the room. The lights flickered, and Dr. Kess cursed under her breath. That was close. They're hitting the outer walls. Ethan turned to the security console, his fingers flying over the controls as he checked the perimeter defenses. The monitors showed Earth's flame forces advancing rapidly, their numbers greater than he had expected. He gritted his teeth. They were running out of time. "We can't hold them off much longer," Ethan said, his voice grim. "We need to finish this before they break through." Dr. Kess worked faster, her hands a blur as she connected the final wires and activated the genetic sequencers. Lirana winced slightly as the machine began its work, but her face remained calm, resolute. She was ready. "We've begun," Dr. Kess announced, her voice steady but strained. "The hybridization process will take time, but, Commander, you need to be ready." Ethan turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Ready for what?" Dr. Kess met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "There's a chance, given the stress Lirana is under, that you may need to stabilize her. Physically, I can manage her vitals, but the connection between you two, it may be crucial to keeping her steady during the procedure." Lirana's eyes flicked up toward Ethan, a look of understanding passing between them. "Our bond is stronger than you realize," she said quietly. "But I need you with me, Ethan. Stay close." Without hesitation, Ethan reached for her hand, feeling the warmth of her silver skin beneath his fingers. The connection between them was instant, a surge of energy passing through him that he couldn't explain but instinctively understood. He tightened his grip, silently promising her that he would be there, no matter what happened. The minutes dragged on, each one marked by the distant thud of explosions and the ever-present hum of the machines around them. Ethan kept his eyes on the monitors, watching as the genetic process unfolded in real time. The fusion of human and Kyle DNA forming something entirely new. But just as hope began to take root, a loud crash shook the door. Earth's flame had found them. "They're here," Ethan growled, pulling his hand away from Liron as to grab the pulse rifle slung over his back. He moved to the door, eyes narrowed, ready for whatever came next. Dr. Kess's voice was tense. "Commander, we need just a few more minutes. Can you hold them off?" Ethan glanced at Lyra Na, who lay still on the table, her body tense as the machine continued its work. He couldn't let them take her. Not now. "I'll hold them," he said through clenched teeth. The door shuddered again, and Ethan braced himself. The moment the door burst open, Earth's flame soldiers flooded in, weapons raised. But Ethan was ready, his pulse rifle blazing as he fired at the intruders, taking down two of them before they could react. His military training took over, every movement precise, every shot lethal. But there were more of them than he had anticipated, and they weren't slowing down. They wanted Lyra dead, and they would stop at nothing to get to her. Dr. Kess, how much longer? Ethan shouted over the chaos, firing another round into the nearest soldier. We're almost there. Just hold them off a little longer. Dr. Kess yelled back, her hands working feverishly over the controls. Ethan's pulse quickened as more soldiers poured into the room. He was outnumbered, but he couldn't afford to fall. Not now. Not when they were so close. Suddenly the lights in the room dimmed, and the machines hummed louder. Lyrana's eyes opened wide, and she gasped as the final stage of the process began. Ethan stole a glance at her, seeing the pain and determination in her face. He had to keep fighting. With a final surge of energy, Ethan pushed forward, unleashing a barrage of fire that forced the remaining Earth's Flame soldiers into retreat. As the last of them fell, silence returned to the room, broken only by the steady hum of the machines. We've done it, Dr. Kess whispered, her voice filled with awe. The hybridization is complete. Ethan lowered his weapon, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned to Lyrano, who lay still on the table, her eyes half closed, but alive. Relief washed over him as he moved to her side, taking her hand once again. It's over, he whispered, squeezing her hand gently. We did it. Lyrana opened her eyes, her golden gaze meeting his. No, she whispered back, a small smile tugging at her lips. It's just begun. And in that moment, Ethan knew she was right. The battle was over, but their journey had only just started. Together, they had forged a desperate alliance, one that would change the future of both their worlds forever. The sterile white walls of the lunar base blurred as Ethan Cage sprinted down the narrow corridors, his pulse pounding in his ears. The deafening alarms and flickering red lights overhead signaled the worsening situation outside. Earth's Flame had breached the outer defenses, and the clock was ticking down faster than anyone had anticipated. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, the discipline of a soldier guiding his every step. But deep inside, a knot of panic was tightening. Beside him, Lyrana struggled to keep pace, her silver skin glistening with a sheen of sweat. The strain of the hybridization process had already begun to show, her usually graceful steps now weighed down by exhaustion. But it wasn't just the fatigue. Ethan could sense the gravity of what they were racing against. The Earth's Flame forces weren't just after them. They were here to stop the future Lyrana was trying to secure for her people. The hybrid child, the key to saving the Kyle species, had to be protected at all costs. We're almost there, Ethan said between breaths, glancing over at her. Just hold on. Lyrana nodded, but Ethan could see the flicker of pain in her golden eyes. I'm fine, she said, her voice steady but betraying the exhaustion she was fighting against. But Ethan, if we don't make it, you must know I don't regret choosing you. Whatever happens, Ethan's heart clenched at her words, but he forced himself to stay focused. We're gonna make it, he replied, his tone firm. I promised I'd get you through this, and I'm not about to break that promise. As they rounded another corner, the sealed doors to the secondary medical bay came into view, a beacon of safety amid the chaos. The reinforced walls of the medical bay were designed to withstand even the most severe assaults, and it was their last hope of finding protection from Earth's Flame. Ethan quickly input the security code into the keypad, the door sliding open with a sharp hiss. He pushed Lyrana through and sealed the door behind them, the heavy locks engaging with a reassuring thud. Inside, the room was a sanctuary of calm. Advanced medical equipment lined the walls, and sterile white floors gleamed under the soft lights. Dr. Amelia Kess was already there waiting for them. The moment they entered, she rushed toward Lyrana, concern etched across her features. Commander Cade, Lyrana, Dr. Kess said, her voice tight. I've prepped the equipment for the final phase of the process, but I won't lie, it's going to be difficult. The genetic integration is delicate, and given the stress she's already under, Ethan interrupted, his tone sharp with urgency. We don't have a choice, Doctor. Earth's Flame is breaking through the outer defenses. We're running out of time. Dr. Kess hesitated for only a second before nodding. Then we have to act now. She moved quickly, guiding Lyra down to the examination table in the center of the room. Lyra winced as she lay down, her body clearly struggling against the strain of the hybridization process. Ethan stood at her side, his hand gripping hers. He could feel the warmth of her skin, and more than that, he could feel the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. The soft hum of the medical equipment came to life as Dr. Kess began the final steps, attaching monitors to Lyra's annas, temples, and adjusting the various instruments. Ethan watched as Lyra's face tightened in concentration, her antennae twitching with the effort it took to remain calm. He knew she was tough, but no amount of strength could change what they were up against. The physical toll was only half of the battle. "How long will it take?" Ethan asked, his voice tense. Dr. Kess glanced at him, her fingers flying across the console. "At least 20 minutes to stabilize the embryo, but we need to get her vitals under control first. The stress of the situation is accelerating everything." 20 minutes. Ethan's jaw tightened. That might as well have been an eternity with Earth's flame closing in. He could already hear the faint echoes of distant gunfire reverberating through the walls. The base's defenses were failing. Lorana's grip tightened on his hand. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice strained but steady. "If they break through before the process is complete—" "They won't," Ethan interrupted. His eyes locked onto hers. "I won't let them get to you. I swear it." Lorana's eyes softened, and for a moment, the fear between them seemed to dissipate. "You've already done more than I could have asked," she said softly. "But this child, they're the future of my people. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you," Ethan insisted, though he couldn't ignore the gnawing fear tightening in his gut. "We're going to make it." Before she could say more, the medical bay's emergency alert system blared to life, the overhead lights flashing red. Dr. Kess cursed under her breath as she glanced at the security monitor. "Damn it. They've breached the inner perimeter. We've got minutes at most." Ethan moved to the monitor, his stomach sinking as he saw Earth's flame forces pouring into the base's lower levels. Their tactical gear was marked with the group symbol, and they moved with terrifying precision. They weren't just there to destroy. They were hunting for Lyra. "They're coming," Dr. Kess said, her voice tight with fear. "I can't stop the procedure now, but it's not stable yet." Ethan's pulse quickened. He knew what he had to do. "Lock the doors. I'll hold them off as long as I can." Lorena's eyes widened in alarm. "Ethan, you can't." "I have to," he said, cutting her off. "I told you I'd keep you safe, and I will. Finish this. I'll buy you the time you need." Without waiting for a response, Ethan grabbed his pulse rifle and moved toward the door. Dr. Kess worked frantically, locking down the medical bay's security protocols, but Ethan knew it would only be a matter of time before Earth's flame found them. He just had to make sure they didn't get through. He positioned himself at the entrance, pulse rifle raised, his heart hammering in his chest. The gunfire was getting closer now, the sound of boots pounding against the metal floors echoing through the hallways outside. He could feel the adrenaline surging through him, sharpening his focus. A crash sounded from just beyond the door. Earth Flame was here. "Stay calm, Cade," he muttered to himself. "Just a little longer." The door shuddered as the first of Earth's flame forces tried to breach it. Ethan's grip tightened on the pulse rifle, his breath steady, his training kicking in. He had fought worse than this before. He had faced impossible odds. But never had the stakes been so high. The door buckled inward, and in an instant, Earth's flame soldiers stormed the room. Ethan opened fire without hesitation, the pulse rifle's energy blasts tearing through the first wave of attackers. He moved with precision, taking cover behind the medical consoles as he returned fire. But more were coming. "Too many, Ethan." Lorana's voice broke through the chaos, but he couldn't turn back. Not yet. He dropped another attacker. His movements fluid, but the numbers were overwhelming. He could see the determination in their faces, their single-minded focus on stopping what was happening in the medical bay. They didn't care about diplomacy, about the future. They only cared about preserving their twisted vision of humanity. Behind him, the medical equipment let out a soft chime. "We're stabilizing." Dr. Kess called out, "But we need another 5 minutes." 5 minutes. It was an eternity. Ethan's muscles burned as he fought, but the attackers were relentless. An explosion rocked the room as one of Earth's flame soldiers hurled a grenade into the far corner, sending consoles flying. He ducked, but the force of the blast knocked him off balance. His pulse rifle skidded across the floor, out of reach. For a split second, Ethan thought it was over. He braced himself as the next wave of attackers charged, their weapons raised. But just before they could reach him, a blinding light filled the room. Ethan shielded his eyes, his breath catching in his throat as the air crackled with energy. Lirana's body glowed with an ethereal light, her antennae raised, her golden eyes wide with focus. The final stage of the hybridization process had begun. The Earth's flame soldiers froze in place, their faces slack with shock and confusion as the energy radiating from Lyra seemed to pulse through the air, immobilizing them. Ethan took the chance. He lunged for his rifle and, in one swift motion, fired at the remaining soldiers, sending them crashing to the ground. The room fell silent. Ethan stumbled to his feet, his body aching from the exertion. He turned back to the medical table, where Lyra Na's glow slowly dimmed, her breathing steady but labored. Dr. Kess let out a breath of relief. It's done. The embryo is stable. Ethan felt a rush of relief wash over him. They had done it. They had bought the time they needed. But as the silence settled over the room, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. They had won the battle, but the war for their future, and the future of both their species, was far from over. The medical bay was filled with a heavy, unnatural silence after the chaos of battle. The sharp smell of scorched metal and ozone hung in the air, the aftermath of pulse fire and explosions leaving the once sterile room in disarray. Ethan Cade stood over Lyra and his motionless body, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the adrenaline from the fight still coursing through him. The glow that had enveloped her moments ago was fading, her silver skin now pale, her golden eyes closed as though in deep sleep. Hours, the machines around her beeped steadily, indicating that she was stable. For now, Ethan's pulse rifle, still warm from the fight, hung loosely from his shoulder. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her, from the woman who had come into his life like a storm and thrown everything into chaos. They had fought so hard to get here, had sacrificed so much to ensure that this moment would come. But now, as the final phase of the hybridization process drew to a close, he wasn't sure what would happen next. Commander Dr. Kess said quietly, pulling Ethan out of his thoughts. She had been working tirelessly at the console, monitoring the hybridization process. We've done it. The genetic integration was successful. The embryo is stable, and Lorana, she's going to be okay. Ethan let out a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding. Relief, sharp and overwhelming, flooded him. He had promised Lyra Na that he'd protect her, that he wouldn't let anything happen to her. And now, for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to believe that they might just make it through this. But even as the relief settled in, a new kind of tension began to rise. The child. The hybrid child that was the culmination of everything. The Kyle's last hope, their only chance at survival. What would they be like? What had they created in this desperate alliance between two species? Can you tell how the child is? Ethan asked, his voice rough. He felt the weight of the question pressing down on him. The future of an entire species rested on the answer. Dr. Kess looked at the screen in front of her, her brow furrowing in concentration. It's hard to say right now, she said, her voice carefully controlled. The embryo is developing rapidly, more quickly than we anticipated. But everything points to it being healthy, strong even. I've never seen anything like this. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. Is it? Do you know what it will look like? Dr. Kess gave him a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. It's still too early to tell exactly. But the integration of human and Kyle DNA is seamless. This child, they'll be a true hybrid. Ethan nodded, though his mind was racing. He had known, of course, what they were doing. He had agreed to it, had fought for it. But now that it was real, now that the child existed within Lyra's nod, the enormity of it all was hitting him like a freight train. Suddenly, the machines around Lorana began to hum louder, and the steady beeping turned to a rapid series of pulses. Dr. Kess's eyes widened in alarm, her hands flying across the console. What's happening? Ethan demanded, his heart leaping into his throat. Sir Daxert's child's development. It's accelerating again, Dr. Kess said, her voice tense. I've never seen anything like this. It's almost as if the child is. Before she could finish, a bright light erupted from Lyrana's body. Ethan staggered back, shielding his eyes from the sudden brilliance. The light was blinding, a pure white energy that filled the room, crackling with an intensity that sent the machines around them into overdrive. Get back, Dr. Kess shouted, pulling Ethan away from Lyrana's side. It's too much. Something's happening with the hybrid. Ethan tried to stay focused, but the light, the power radiating from Lyran, was overwhelming. It wasn't just light. It was something more. He could feel it, pulsing in the air, vibrating in his bones like an electric current coursing through the room. His heart raced as he realized what was happening. The hybrid child wasn't just developing. It was awakening. Suddenly the light faded as quickly as it had appeared, and the room fell into a deafening silence. Ethan blinked rapidly, trying to clear the spots from his vision. His body felt strange, lighter somehow, as though something inside him had shifted. Dr. Kess, he called out, his voice tight. What just happened? Dr. Kess's voice wavered as she stared at the console, her hands trembling. I don't know. That surge, it came from the child. I've never seen anything like this. It's like the child just... Ethan's stomach twisted. He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes locked on Lorena, who was still lying motionless on the table. But something was different. He could feel it. A connection, a strange awareness that hadn't been there before. It was faint, but it was real. A bond between him, Lyrana, and the child. It pulsed faintly in his mind, like a whisper just out of reach. As Ethan reached for Lyrana's hand, her eyes fluttered open. Her golden irises glowed faintly in the dim light, and for a moment she seemed to stare right through him, as if seeing something far beyond the room they were in. Ethan, her voice was soft, almost fragile, but filled with wonder. I can feel it. Ethan knelt beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly. What do you mean? Feel what? Lyrana's antennae twitched, her eyes unfocused. The child, I can feel them. They're alive, fully aware. More than I expected. Before she could finish, her entire body tensed, and her eyes widened with shock. Ethan leaned in closer, his heart hammering in his chest. Lyrana, what's wrong? Her voice trembled as she whispered. They're trying to reach out to us. Ethan, they're communicating. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The child was trying to communicate. Already? Dr. Kess moved closer, her face pale as she monitored the vitals. This isn't possible, she murmured, her voice shaking. The child's neural activity, it's off the charts. It's developing too fast. Ethan felt the pulse of the connection in his mind intensify. It was subtle, but it was there. A presence, a consciousness pressing against his own. He could feel it reaching out, searching for something. The sensation sent a shiver down his spine. He had been prepared to help Lyrana, to help the Kyle, but this was something entirely beyond what he had imagined. Ethan, Lyrana said, her voice trembling as she clutched his hand. The child, they're different, so much more than either of us expected. They're not just a hybrid, they're something new. Hassan swallowed hard, his thoughts spinning. What do you mean? What are they? Lyrana's gaze softened, her expression one of awe and fear mixed together. They're a bridge, Ethan. A bridge between our species. But more than that, they're the future. I can feel it. Dr. Kess's hands shook as she read the data streaming across the console. The child's physiology is rewriting itself as we speak, she said in disbelief. This kind of rapid development, it's unheard of. Ethan tried to make sense of it all, but the connection in his mind kept growing stronger, pulling at him, urging him to focus. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to open up to the presence. And then for the briefest moment, he felt it, a flicker of thought, not words, but feelings, curiosity, awareness, and something else, something far more profound, love. It was as if the child, still forming within Lyrana, understood its purpose, understood the love that had gone into its creation. And now it was reaching out, trying to connect with the two people who had brought it into existence. Ethan's eyes flew open, and he stared down at Lyrana, his heart pounding. They're reaching out to us, he said, his voice thick with emotion. They know we're here. Lyrana smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Yes, they're our child, Ethan. And they're already more than we could have imagined. As the connection pulsed through them both, Ethan knew that their lives had changed forever. This child, this hybrid, wasn't just the key to the Kial's survival. They were the key to something much bigger, something neither human nor Kyle had ever dreamed possible. Together, Ethan and Lyra had created something entirely new. And now, they would face the future hand in hand, with a child who would bridge the gap between their worlds, forging a new path for both their peoples. The quiet hum of the USS Harmony filled the bridge, but the tension was palpable. Ethan Cade stood at the viewport, staring out into the endless expanse of space. Below them, Earth hung like a blue gem, serene and unaware of the storm of change that was brewing above. Beyond Earth's orbit, the Kyle fleet shimmered, their obsidian ships sleek and alien against the starry backdrop. It was a sight that only a few months ago would have seemed impossible, a symbol of unity between two species that had been worlds apart. But now it was more than just an alliance of necessity. It was the dawn of something new. Behind him, Lyra approached quietly, her silver skin glowing softly in the dim light of the ship. In her arms was Orion, their hybrid child, wrapped in a delicate blue cloth. The child was small, barely a few days old, but already filled with a quiet, intense awareness. Ethan could feel it every time he held them. The sense that Orion wasn't just an infant, but something much. Lyra smiled softly as she reached Ethan's side, glancing out the viewport before turning her attention to him. "You've been standing here for a while," she said, her voice gentle. "Are you nervous?" Ethan let out a slow breath, turning his gaze from the stars to his daughter. "I wouldn't call it nervous," he replied, though there was a tension in his voice, more like, "I'm trying to figure out how the hell we're going to explain all of this to the world." Lyra nodded, understanding his hesitation. "The Kyle are ready to stand by the decision we made," she said. "But you're right. Earth may not be so accepting." Ethan reached out and gently stroked Orion's tiny hand, marveling at how small and delicate it was. Her skin was a light lavender, a perfect blend of his own human features and Lyra's silver tones. The child's faint antennae twitched as they sensed his touch, and her eyes, a striking mix of blue and brown, opened slightly, gazing up at him with a curiosity that always sent a shiver down his spine. "She's beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Lyra smiled softly. "She's our future." For a moment they stood in silence, absorbing the gravity of the situation. Orion wasn't just a child. She was the first of her kind, a hybrid of human and Kyle DNA, and the product of a desperate alliance that had saved an entire species from extinction. But beyond the scientific and political implications, there was something even more profound about her existence. Orion represented hope, a bridge between two worlds that had once been separated by fear and mistrust. "We've come a long way," Ethan said, his tone thoughtful. "But now the hard part begins." Lurana looked at him, her golden eyes reflecting the weight of his words. "You're right, but we don't have to face it alone." Before Ethan could respond, a voice crackled through the ship's communication system. "Commander Cade, we're receiving a transmission from the United Earth Council. They're ready for you." Ethan's stomach twisted with a mixture of anticipation and dread. This was it, the moment they'd been preparing for. After everything they'd been through, the battles, the sacrifices, the impossible choices, it had all led to this. Now, they had to face the political fallout of what they had done, and the world was watching. Ethan glanced at Lyra, who gave him a reassuring nod. "We faced this together," she said. With a deep breath, Ethan turned and made his way toward the ship's communication room, Lyra following close behind with Orion cradled in her arms. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a large screen that dominated the center of the room. On the screen, the familiar faces of Earth's highest-ranking officials appeared, their expressions a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Among them was General Wallace, the head of the lunar base where this all began, his stern face betraying little emotion. Beside him sat the United Earth Council president, a woman with sharp features and piercing eyes, who was known for her firm stance on Earth sovereignty. "Commander Cade," the president began, her tone formal. "I understand you have something to share with us." Ethan cleared his throat, nodding as he stepped forward. "Yes, Madam President, I do. But first, I want to thank you for agreeing to this meeting." I know the situation has escalated quickly, and there's a lot we need to address. The president raised an eyebrow. That's an understatement, Commander. The Kyle's arrival and their request for human DNA have sparked widespread concern. There are questions, serious questions, about what this means for the future of humanity. Ethan nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. I understand the concerns, Madam President. But before I answer those questions, I need to introduce someone. He gestured to Lyra Na, who stepped forward with Orion in her arms. The council members' eyes widened in surprise, their murmurs audible through the communication feed. General Wallace's normally impassive face registered something close to shock as his gaze fell on the child. "This is Orion," Ethan said, his voice firm but gentle. "She's a hybrid, a mix of human and Kyle DNA, and she represents the future of both our species." The room fell silent. The president's eyes narrowed as she studied Orion, her expression unreadable. "A hybrid," she repeated, as though testing the word in her mouth. "You've actually created a hybrid child." Ethan nodded, glancing at Lyra Na for support before continuing. "Yes, it was a necessary step to ensure the survival of the Kiel species. Their people are on the brink of extinction, and human DNA is compatible with their physiology in ways we didn't fully understand until now. Orion is proof that this cooperation can work." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched thick and tense as the council members processed the enormity of what had just been revealed. Finally, General Wallace broke the silence, his voice gruff but measured. "And what does this mean for us?" he asked, his gaze flicking between Ethan and Lyra's Na for Earth. "What do you expect us to do with this information?" Ethan squared his shoulders, meeting Wallace's gaze head-on. "We don't expect anything, General. But what I'm asking for is understanding. The Kyle are not a threat. They came to us out of desperation, seeking our help, and we responded. Orion is the result of that alliance, and now she represents the possibility of something more. A future where humans and Kyle can coexist, where we can learn from each other." The president leaned forward, her fingers steepled in front of her. "And you think humanity will simply accept this? That we'll embrace this child and the Kyle without question?" Lyra spoke then, her voice calm but filled with resolve. "We do not expect immediate acceptance, Madam President. We know that trust takes time, but what we ask for is the opportunity to build that trust. Orion is not just our child. She is the bridge between our people, a bridge that we believe can lead to a new era of cooperation." There was another long pause, the weight of their words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, the president spoke again, her tone softer but still cautious. "This will not be easy. There are factions, powerful factions, on Earth that will resist this. Earth Flame is only the beginning. You've seen the protests, the anger. There are those who believe that our purity as a species is at stake." Ethan nodded grimly. "We know, and we're prepared to face those challenges. But we also believe that there are people who will see the potential here, who will understand that this isn't about erasing what makes us human. It's about survival. It's about growth." The president's eyes lingered on Orion for a moment longer before she leaned back in her chair. "You're asking for a great deal, Commander. But I also understand the magnitude of what's at stake. We'll need time to discuss this with the Council to prepare for the political ramifications. But I won't make any promises today." Ethan exhaled slowly, grateful for even a small measure of understanding. "That's all we ask, Madam President. Time and the chance to prove that this alliance can work." The president nodded once before the screen went dark, leaving the room in silence. For a moment, Ethan and Lyra stood there, their hearts still racing from the intensity of the conversation. Then, slowly, Ethan turned to her, his eyes softening as he looked down at Orion. "We did it," he whispered, relief washing over him like a wave. "We took the first step." Lorana smiled, her golden eyes filled with hope. "Yes, but this is only the beginning." Ethan nodded, his hand resting on Orion's tiny head. Together they had faced the impossible and survived. Now they stood on the threshold of a new dawn, one where humans and Kyle could build a future together. As they gazed out at the stars beyond the viewport, Ethan knew that the challenges ahead were far from over. There would be resistance, fear, and uncertainty. But with Lyra by his side and Orion in their arms, he also knew that they were ready. For the first time, he truly believed in the future they were creating, a future where two worlds could become one.